Hey, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs. Welcome to the first of our series of afternoon artist talks that we're putting on this year. Afrofuturism, visions of the future from the other side. And my God, this is such a strange way to do things. But yeah, thank you very, very much for joining us all. It is a great pleasure to introduce to you now critic and festival programmer Carolyn Mauricette.
Oh, whoops, sorry.
Hi, you have to just turn on your camera?
Okay. Can you hear me?
A little, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know why my...
Your camera still seems to be off.
Now I can start it. I can start it.
Okay.
There we go. Hi. Hey.
Hey, thank you so much for doing this with us.
Oh, no, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a privilege. So I'm going to step out now and close my camera, and I will be watching and listening.
All right. I'm just going to share my screen here.
All right. Have a good talk.
All right. Thank you so much. All righty. So thank you so much for tuning in. I'm really excited to present this to you. I just want to do a land acknowledgement. So the City of Toronto acknowledges that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So I have a script because I tend to babble a bit and ramble. So anyway, I'm just going to get started. So I was honored to be asked to do a lecture for the Black Museum in Toronto this past February. So shout out to Gina Freitag, Paul Karup, and Andrea Subasati, who all run the Black Museum. So I chose the 1971 film, The Omega Man, for its inadvertent themes of Afrofuturism. I talked about how co-star Rosalind Cash, who plays Lisa, represented Black culture in a dystopian future, and how the diverse crew of orphans gave hope for a multicultural new world. This is important because in a lot of science fiction and speculative fiction, the future doesn't often include BIPOC. It's usually a vision of the status quo being kept in an insular, colorless utopia. So Afrofuturism is often a mystery to a lot of people, and they think of it in relation to the 2018 blockbuster Black Panther, for instance. I'm not going to talk about Black Panther because there's so much on it and it's a clear representation of Afrofuturism. But Afrofuturism, what I'm talking about, is a broader movement that has a larger impact. So I'm going to be talking about Afrofuturism, what it is, and how it defies the white patriarchal code of representation in the future. From technology to books to film, Black creators take a stand and place their own narratives within visions of a future world. So in order to see why Afrofuturism is important and where it fits into the scheme of representation, we need to see where the issue of misrepresentation begins. And that's right, you guessed it, it's colonialism and the slave trade. So how we are perceived as Black people plays a huge role in how we are treated historically. Black people have been dehumanized because of enslavement for centuries in order to build economies. Black origins and Black history has been systematically erased and our existence governed by white supremacy, from being property to being excluded from buying property via redlining. And the entertainment industry is one large aspect of this. So humanity has always defaulted to whiteness, and anything outside of whiteness is coded as a threat to purity or the other. So the other has been classified by scholars and sociologists as a social identity that is ostracized or dominated by a group that holds power over race, gender, or religion. And according to applied sociologist Zuleika Zavelos, she actually has a great website called The Other Sociologist, and she focuses on specifically the other. So she says that sociologists are interested in the ways in which notions of otherness are managed in society. For example, we study how some groups become stigmatized as outsiders and how such ideas change over time. So the other is almost always on the outside unless the other assimilates to majority rule. So you can see how this obviously applies to Black people. In Adelifu Nama's book, Black Space, Imagining Race in Science Fiction Film, he points out how Cold War fears and civil rights unrest created racial coding and realities where in science fiction, whites were the only survivors, the most sophisticated species, and they were threatened or opposed visually by an alien other. So for example, Star Wars. There's always a misunderstood creature or entity that doesn't belong, and the representation is one-dimensional or tries to shift focus from the real matters of inequality at hand. So you've seen the old-timey ads for everyday items littered with caricatures of Blacks. So large red lips, bulging white eyes, and the darkest skin. We're seeing that Aunt Jemima is just now being removed. So that tells you how ingrained these images are. And you can actually read a wonderful article on the history of Aunt Jemima on Dr. Cheryl Thompson, who is an associate professor at the Creative Industries at Ryerson University. And she's got a great article on it. This imagery is also called propaganda by Harvard scholar and historian Henry Louis Gates Jr. So blackface started in the 1830s in minstrel shows. The most famous character being Jim Crow, who would also be the namesake of the anti-Black Jim Crow laws. It was a way of depicting Blacks in the most stereotypical ways for white entertainment in vaudeville and on screen, enforcing the myth that slaves were mentally inferior and content to be in servitude. You can check out Dr. Thompson again. She actually has done extensive research on blackface in Canada, and she actually calls this the tradition of exclusion. So let's go to kind of the father of all stereotypes, which is Birth of a Nation. In D.W. Griffith's epic cinematic spectacle, he documents two families during the Civil War and Reconstructionist era after the end of slavery and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, who are seen as heroes here who keep the freed, power-crazed Blacks in line. So this film was an adaptation of Thomas Dixon's book, The Klansman. And it's here that Griffith introduces some major stereotypes. And that's described in Donald Bogle's book, Toms, Coons, Mulattoes, Mammies, and Butts. So we have faithful souls or Mammies and Uncle Toms, the Black Brute, described as subhuman, feral, and violent, the pure Black buck, oversexed, frenzied, and lusted after white flesh, the tragic mulatto, and the sapphire. So characters, both white and Black actors, had to wear blackface. So Black actors could not act unless they wore blackface if they wanted to perform. So we have some examples of Black characters who were portraying interpretations, white interpretations of characters. So we have the first is Step and Fetch It, played by Lincoln Perry. He was a Black vaudeville actor who famously played lazy, befuddled characters in the 1930s. So he opened the door for Black actors, despite the controversial characters he played. And there's also Hattie McDaniels, we all know. She's the quintessential Mammy character from 1939, Gone with the Wind. She's the first Black woman to win an Oscar for this role. And this role actually went on to inform many characters and roles for Black women in the future. The tragic mulatto. This is an actress called Freddie Washington, and she played Piola in the 1934 Imitation of Life. I think there's 3 versions of that film. But she plays a light-skinned Black woman who passes for white and leaves her Black mother behind to find a new life. So this is a narrative of a person with no real anchor as they straddle both the Black and white worlds. We also have Uncle Tom, the long-suffering servant who is ecstatic to be living in servitude. So we can see this in Disney Song of the South. Uncle Remus, played by James Baskett, and it was an attempt to capture the so-called idyllic South. We have The Black Brute in Mendingo, which was a book turned into a film, and the book was written by Kyle Onstott about a slave who was purchased as a fighter and a lover to the white mistress of that plantation. The character's name is Ganymede, and he was played by boxer Ken Norton. So this checks all the boxes of a brute who is feared and sexualized for his virility. And then we have Sapphire, which is an actual character's name. So this is Sapphire Stevens, played by Ernestine Wade, and she was the shrew-like wife who bossed her husband around on the show Amos and Andy. She represented the aggressive, sassy Black woman who rolled into the sassy Black friend in modern times. Amos and Andy has an interesting history because it was created by two white writers and actors, and they did it on the radio. So they basically lampooned Black voices. Then they did blackface stints for promotions. And then the TV show became the first Black network show when they cast it with an all-Black cast. So although these actors opened the door for Blacks to be represented on the big screen, their characters were problematic. They simultaneously represented Black people in the media and perpetuated stereotypes. Although Stephen Fetchit and Hattie McDaniels gave subversive performances, they kind of gave a wink and a nod, kind of showing that they knew what was going on instead of being like clueless. There was small amounts of progress made also with Amos and Andy with an all-Black cast, but there's a sense that they lived two lives. So the way Blacks perceive themselves in modern society is summed up by W.E.B. Du Bois or Dubois. I will pronounce it the American way, Du Bois, with his double consciousness theory. So he basically says that Black people are living two lives. We're always looking at ourselves through the eyes of others, and we have two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideas in one dark body. So it's basically how whites see us and how we see ourselves. So is there any wonder why we wanted to change the perception of how we Black people were portrayed? In an almost alternate reality, Blacks retaliated against Birth of a Nation by creating their own films, defying the oppression and lifting themselves up during and after slavery. So we have some prominent Black performers, artists, and leaders. So this came out of migration of Blacks heading north to create a renaissance of Black artists and performers, or the Harlem Renaissance, that kept our image in our own hands as proof that we aren't just caricatures and we could have agency over our own narrative. So we have Josephine Baker, who is a dancer, singer extraordinaire. She's also a spy and an activist. Langston Hughes, a poet, playwright, and educator. Zora Neale Hurston, who was a writer and folklorist. Pan-Africanist leader Marcus Garvey, jazz singer Bessie Smith, and there was also a wave of Black independent film championed by William Foster and Oscar Micheaux here, who strive to make complex films for Black audiences. I just want to point out too, in this alternate reality, we have Blacks in science, technology, engineering, and math. We have, for instance, the first African-American to have a patent for dry cleaning, Thomas L. Jennings. We have a Canadian, Elijah McCoy, who invented lubricants for industrial use. We have Madam C.J. Walker, who was the first self-made millionaire. So we have these Black pioneers who represented us in like such amazing ways, but we don't really hear about them. So after these pioneers, there would be decades of representation from the 1940s to present day, where Black people in film would revolve around both Black and white productions in film and television, creating stars like Lena Horne, Sidney Poitier, Ossie Davis, Dorothy Dandridge, and Cicely Tyson. And in genre, and these are just a few, we have Dwayne Jones, the fearless Eartha Kitt, Nichelle Nichols, Rosalind Cash, and LeVar Burton. Also Billy D. Williams as Lando Calrissian. So what we've seen up till now is how we've been perceived and how we fought against that perception, but not without resistance and restriction, like the motion picture production code. So that was a set of rules in Hollywood and regulations, and it was created in the 1930s to uphold moral standards in film. And rule number 6, where miscegenation or race mixing was denied. So we see this being defied with Nichelle Nichols and Rosalind Cash. So they took that risk by giving us 2 of the first interracial kisses on the big screen and the small screen. And while it does fetishize and sensationalize these moments, they were very much bold steps. There wasn't a name for this besides progress until you start to break it down. So here's where we get into Afrofuturism. So you've heard the term used when, again, describing Black Panther, but what does it mean exactly? Well, it's a term coined by Mark Derry, a white cultural critic, in his 1992 essay, Black to the Future, Interviews with Samuel R. Delany, Greg Tate, and Trisha Rose. In this essay, he speaks to prominent Black writers about why there's a lack of Black people writing speculative fiction. So his focus is on innovation and technology. Basically, speculative fiction that involves people of color instead of omitting us. So a lot of Black people have embraced this term, and some reject it because it comes from a white critic, and it's another label for us, not created by us. So we also have Natasha Womack, and she is a Black writer and filmmaker, and she expanded on this term. And she wrote a book called Afrofuturism, The World of Black Sci-Fi and Fantasy Culture, and this is her definition. And basically she says that Afrofuturists redefine culture and notions of Blackness for today and the future. So it involves speculative fiction, fantasy, Afrocentricity, magical realism. It re-envisions the past and speculates about the future. So it's really quite a mutable definition that encompasses more of what Black people are. And she wrote her book to connect music, comics, film, and art into one amalgamation of Afrofuturism to unite people who thought the same things about the movement. For her, it's a lifestyle, it's a way of thinking and creative space. I also want to point out that this definition also incorporates the missing history that was erased during enslavement with a future vision. And it's a melding of African mysticism and future speculation, as well as identity and politics in a non-linear way. So for this presentation, I'm featuring on North American Afrofuturism, but I just want to point out that Black North Americans and the African diaspora experience Black futures differently. So there are Africans who don't prescribe to the Afrofuturism moniker because it deals with a Western version of the future. So from what I've gathered, there are Africans who want social change and a tangible future that doesn't so much involve fantasy, but more a decolonization and less industrialization called African futurism. There's also African surrealism, which we'll see later, and a term coined by Wanuri Kahui called Afro Bubblegum. And she is the director of the futuristic short Kumsi and the feature-length Rafiki. And if you haven't seen these films, you have to seek them out. Rafiki is just so beautiful and heartwarming. So she basically says in her TED Talk, Fun, Fierce, and Fantastical African Art, it's the advocacy of art for art's sake, art that isn't policy-driven or agenda-driven. It's just for the sake of imagination. And she really wants to focus on the point that Africa has always been seen as a place of despair, of disease, of wars, and she just doesn't want to have that as an example of Africa. She wants to show that people who have hope and joy, it's a radical thing. So it's very important to notice these distinctions. So we're going to go on to some pioneers of Afrofuturism. So we have, again, W.E.B. Du Bois or Du Bois. He co-founded the NAACP. He's the father of modern sociology and an activist. He's one of the early African-American writers of speculative and science fiction. He wrote a story called The Comet, which is very close to I Am Legend or The Omega Man, except the main character is a Black man, and he's stuck in New York after a comet hits. So you should check that story out. It's really great. He's also the first African-American to earn a PhD at Harvard in 1895. And of course, he has the theory of double consciousness. We have the prolific science fiction writer, Samuel R. Delany. He was an openly gay man, even though he was married to poet Marilyn Hacker. He is one of the writers interviewed for Mark Derry's exploration of Afrofuturism. And yeah, he's got a lot of interesting things to say about Afrofuturism as well. And we have the godmother of Afrofuturism, Octavia E. Butler. So she's the first critically acclaimed African-American female science fiction writer. She's an award-winning author, and she's written Kindred, Pattern Maker, Mind of My Mind, Parable of the Sower, and Fledgling. She made a point of writing herself in by creating Black female protagonists to fill a lack of representation. So she's very important here because you'll see later on a lot of her projects are being adapted, or a lot of her books are being adapted. And then we have Tananarive Due and Stephen Barnes. They are speculative fiction and horror writing couple extraordinaire. Tananarive Due is a professor at UCLA and teaches courses on Black horror and Afrofuturism. She's an award-winning author and also the executive producer of the documentary Horror Noir. Stephen Barnes is a New York Times best-selling, award-winning writer and screenwriter. Together, they conduct online courses on horror writing and Afrofuturism, and they are just a treat to watch. They are so incredible. We have Nayla Hawkinson. She's a Jamaican-born Canadian award-winning science fiction speculative fiction author. She wrote Brown Girl in the Ring, which was adapted for a film, which we'll talk about later on. She uses Afro-Caribbean folklore and storytelling as a basis for her narratives. She also teaches creative writing at the University of California, Riverside. We have Nnedi Okorafor. She creates African-based science fiction due to her Nigerian-American heritage. Her novel, Who Fears Death, is being adapted for HBO. She's created her own production company, African Futurism Productions. She's written graphic novels for Marvel and the Black Panther characters. And she's also an associate professor of creative writing at the University of Buffalo. We also have Zetta Elliott. She's a Canadian author living in the US. She's a poet and playwright, and she's self-published after being rejected numerous times in Canada. She wrote from an early age and wanted to write fiction for Black children to make them more seen, and she decolonized her imagination. And what she means by that is that she was writing stories with white characters, and then she realized, wait a minute, I'm Black, and she decolonized her imagination and started writing about Black characters. So now we're getting to film and media. And we're going to start off with another kind of father of Afrofuturism. So we have Sun Ra here, and he was the leader of his ensemble, the Sun Ra Orchestra. He was a pioneer in avant-garde jazz, incorporating African drums and multiple keyboards. He questioned Eurocentric teaching and thought outside of mainstream practices. He felt he was a healer, that music induced telepathy, and that he was actually from Saturn. So when you think about that, you might think that he's a little off, but when you think about how Blacks were treated, his logic isn't wrong, because he wanted to remove Blacks from Earth to find a different planet. And he wanted to rescue Black people basically from Earth, because he felt that Earth was death for Black people. So he is a huge influence on Afrofuturism. And then we have George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic. He was inspired by Sun Ra. He made Astral Liberation Party music, and basically he bridged the past and the future. We have Earth, Wind, and Fire, who wanted to have a cosmic awareness, mind expansion, and have a spiritual kind of vibe without force feeding it to their listeners. And then we have Janelle Monáe, critically acclaimed singer, actor, and producer. She created a Metropolis-inspired alter ego called Cindy Mayweather. It was a prophetic android mediator for the world. And we have Missy Elliott, who we all know and I love. And she embraces technology, innovation, and all forms of music. And she's remained so relevant. She's worked with so many musicians as well. And then we have the 80s electronic hip hop band Nucleus. Now, they had this hit Jam On It, and I know you all know it. I'm not gonna sing it, but you know that song if you heard it. And they named their second and final album after Sun Ra Spaces and Place. And I'm pretty sure that Daft Punk was inspired by them if you listen to the two bands. We also have Beyonce, known for her uncanny talent and business acumen. She uses Afrofuturistic imagery and most recently seen in her visual album, Black is King. She also was inspired by Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust, which is an Afrofuturistic film as well for her visual album, Lemonade. We also have F.K. Twigs, who is a British performer with a futuristic sound and striking imagery with an Afrofuturistic experimental vibe. So we're going to get into comics now, specifically Black comics, obviously, because they have a real influence on some upcoming slides here. So professor, artist, and comic book writer John Jennings, he creates Afrofuturistic drawings and graphic novels. He's illustrated Kindred and Parable of the Sower. They're graphic novel adaptations of Octavia Butler's books. He also provided the cover art for Ytasha Womack's book. And then we had the Niobe series about an elven warrior princess created by actress Amanda Stenberg and Sebastian A. Jones. It's illustrated by Ashley A. Woods and other artists, and it's being developed for HBO. And also Ashley A. Woods did there's some visual effects for Lovecraft Country as well, so I was really excited to see that. We also have N.K. Jemisin, the first Black science fiction writer to win a Best Novel Hugo Award, and the first person to win 3 Hugo Awards in a row. So she's written Far Sector, a comic series based on a new Green Lantern character named Sojourner Mullen. So as I was saying, comics have a huge influence, and we can see with Blade, Spawn, and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, even though, I mean, I think Spawn people weren't really that jazzed about it, but it's still representation when you look at it. So now that we have a broad sense of what Afrofuturism is and how it's represented, I want to turn it towards film specifically. So for those of you who are familiar with horror noir, the documentary based on Dr. Robin Mean Coleman's book, this takes you on a journey showing you an historical breakdown of Black horror and genre film. So that concentrates a lot on the history. So I encourage you to watch it and watch it again if you've seen it. So we're going to start with film, obviously, again, The Omega Man. I have such love for that film. It's bonkers, but I love it. So this is adapted from Richard Matheson's book, I Am Legend. It's the story of a scientist who survives a vampire virus, along with a woman and a crew of children. And he's injected himself with the antidote, and he's basically the savior. So the family here, they are representative of the Black Panthers, and there's also, as I said, a white savior trope and a multi-ethnic group of young people escaping with the white savior's blood. So this is one of the few sci-fi films, the early sci-fi films, that cast a Black female lead. We also have The Brother from Another Planet. So this was done by a white director, John Sayles. This stars Joe Morton, and he plays an alien who crashes on Earth and moves through Harlem, observing Earthlings prattle on about their daily lives. He's being hunted by 2 men in blacks, looking to return him back to the planet he escaped from. He's stuck in a situation beyond his control, and he's on Earth as a mute alien. That's both telling and problematic at the same time. It's a commentary on displaced people in not so much a hostile world, but an indifferent one. We also have Born in Flames. This is also done by a white director, Lizzie Borden. She's a feminist director and the loveliest person. This story is about a dystopian future where women are targets and rally together for their rights. So this film has a Black lead played by Jean Satterfield. The lead's name is Adelaide Nordis. You can see her here in the poster. And she becomes a martyr for women's rights. So this film was a collaborative effort, and it gave voice to the women who live radical lives. So these actresses in the film were actually living these radical feminist lives. So these 2 white filmmakers take on displaced people and Black feminism in a futuristic way, and they're playing on themes of otherness. And I have to mention Will Smith. He's made a name for himself as the Black Everyman, and he's done his fair share of popular sci-fi like Independence Day, Men in Black, The Misguided Bright. I saw that there's a sequel coming. So anyway, but I can't leave him out because he has done a lot for science fiction and Black representation. But I also feel like he's been overly commodified as a vehicle for white narratives of Black inclusion. But I would like to pose a question. Everybody knows about After Earth here, and I know he wasn't even that thrilled about it. He's apparently still upset about it. But was it a bad film for being a bad film, or was it a bad film because industry folks told him to stay in his lane? Because I read that he had a whole line of comic books he wanted to do. He wanted to start a series. He wanted to kind of create this, world where there were Black people. So I just posed that question because, I mean, you can knock the film, that's fine, but was there something else in play as well? So let's move on to Afro-surrealism, which I mentioned earlier. So Crusoe is an absurdist horror comedy by Flying Lotus, otherwise known as Steve Ellison or Flylo. He's a musician, producer, DJ, and he is also the grandson of songwriter Marilyn McLeod, who wrote songs for people like Marvin Gaye. And he's the grandnephew of John Coltrane, who has also been described as a creator of Afrofuturistic sounds in Womack's book. So Crusoe, which is an expletive in Japanese, is a vile, funny, shocking, and unexpected film. Flylo uses imagery, music, and social commentary in each vignette to convey his vision of a near future. So we have Sorry to Bother You. That's another absurdist comedy by Boots Riley. He's also a musical artist with his group La Coupe. And this film has a lot of Afrofuturistic tones and also incorporates Du Bois's double consciousness as Cassius Green, who is played by Lakeith Stanfield. He navigates a world of greed and corruption by sounding white, but, and I'm going to go back to my other point, not Will Smith white. That's a quick quote from the film. So this satire follows him as he gains success because he's basically assimilated and he's rewarded for it. So we have next, See You Yesterday. It's directed by Stefan Bristol, where a teenage girl, CJ, played by Eden Duncan Smith, and her friend devises a time machine and uses it to try to save her brother's life, who was killed in a mistaken identity confrontation with police. This is real social justice melded with science fiction. This inserts Black genius with the main character. There's also A Wrinkle in Time, directed by Ava DuVernay, and an adaptation of the book by Madeleine L'Engle about a girl named Meg, played by Storm Reed, who travels across the universe to find her missing father. So this little girl is a math genius, and both films feature Black girls in STEM, and they take charge and they are basically the hope for the future. We have a couple of more films here by white directors, and these are two fairly important for a particular reason. So we have Kin, that's directed by Australian twin brothers Josh and Jonathan Baker. So this sci-fi crime drama is about a displaced or othered Black boy. His name is Eli, played by Miles Truitt, and he's adopted by a white family. He reconnects with his white brother, who is a petty criminal, and they become embroiled in a crime caper that becomes more complicated with the futuristic weapon Eli finds. Fast Color is directed by Julia Hart, and this shows 3 generations of Black women who have superpowers in a dystopian future. They must hide from officials because of their powers, especially Ruth, the main character, played by Gugu Mbatha Raw, who can control the weather. So this film is important because the director made a conscious effort to uncenter herself from the narrative and collaborated with the Black cast to create an authentic characterization. Also, the screenwriter for Kin, he also he made Eli universal. He's this little black boy who finds a ray gun, and you just know that he plays video games. And most boys will play video games. So it's kind of nice to see a universal character like that. We have Brown Girl Begins. This is the film adaptation of Nayla Hawkinson's award-winning book, Brown Girl in the Ring. It's directed by Canadian director Sharon Lewis. We follow a young Black woman who is caught between her duty to the legacy of magic and her quest for love. There's elements of horror, Afro-Caribbean folklore, and there's also evil forces that work against her. The Girl with All the Gifts is about Melanie, played by Sinia Nanua. And Melanie is a girl who is infected with a fungus that makes her hungry for human flesh. So she's highly intelligent, and after a breach at the compound she lives at, she must help her human captors to safety. So Melanie is also basically the hope for humankind, and she's going to be experimented on, but she finds her power. And both of these characters are young and coming into their power in a dystopian future, and one that may not hold hope, but they have power to change that. We also have Attack the Block, directed by Joe Cornish. And this is about a group of kids living in the British version of the projects or council estates. They have to fight an alien invasion. So they band together to save the Earth from this alien threat. And it gives us a Black hero in Moses, played by John Boyega, and shows us that heroes don't have to be white middle-class men. These savvy kids are also resourceful because of their environment. Alien versus Predator gives us Sanaa Lathan as Alexa Woods, and she's confident and defies stereotype. She forms an alliance with the other, the Predator. And while this film got panned, the director Paul W.S. Anderson puts a Black woman in an action sci-fi horror as the hero. So these two characters go against the grain and place themselves in charge of their destinies. And I had said before on a podcast recently that this is one of my all-time favorite films, and it's done by Jordan Peele, and he's opened the floodgates of representation. He has said time and time again that he makes horror films, so I respect that, but there's also the terror of what science can do to Black people, or the implications of how science affects society as we know it. So Us is the epitome of Afrofuturism to me. We have a Black middle-class family who has evil twins of themselves, well, supposedly evil twins, created by the government. This film is so layered that it's overwhelming. We have a female protagonist and antagonist, mirror images of each other. Peele points out specifically that he wanted a Black hairstyle for Adelaide, sister locks. There's also dark-skinned Black people who aren't being ridiculed because of their skin color. And there are some critiques that call on themes pulling from W.B. Du Bois and his theory of double consciousness, theories of class, biblical references, the horrific, the other, and according to Peele, Us is where science and religion meets. We also have Get Out. That's a clear example of Black futures in a horrific way. It shows how we are still commodified despite the legal abolishment of slavery. It also shows how technology basically saps Black people's power to energize the white supremacists around us. And he's also revamped the Twilight Zone series, and where he continues to put a mirror up to society and show us how strange and destructive we are. So let's talk about the future. So there's a new teen show called Utopian Falls, and I discovered that through BSAM Canada, and they are an Afrofuturist organization, and they promote events around the town in Toronto. And this Utopia Falls is a Canadian production, and it's about a dystopian future that involves the arts, dance, hip hop in a huge way. So I think that a lot of people miss this because I think it just came out before the pandemic. It also pulls on Womack's definition of Afrofuturism, because she also involves dance and music and movement, and she's very fluid about it. And I was kind of surprised about how much this show was being panned. to me, it's clearly for a younger audience, and it's been described as primitive by a white critic. And it's never okay to call a production filled with BIPOC primitive. So I just wanted to give a shout out to the show. There's also Lovecraft Country, which if you haven't watched it yet, you have to check it out. So incredible. There's so many other shows I wanted to talk about, but this is just a little kind of blueprint here of what's happening. So even though we're still dealing with bias, for instance, if you see the documentary Coded Bias, we're dealing with AI that will not recognize Black features. There's a new day coming. Viola Davis is working to produce Octavia Butler's Wild Seed for Amazon with a script written by Wanuri Kahui and Nnedi Okorafor. There's Black Twitter, there's Afropunk. Questlove has an innovation incubator called Creative House. There's Ashley Blackwell's website, graveyardshift-sisters.com. And there's a huge arts movement in Toronto and Canada of Afrofuturistic artists, namely Komi Olaf, Quentin Versetti, Enes Satir, just to name a few. And we also have Dory Tunstall, the first Black female dean who is at the helm of OCAD here in Toronto, working for the future of Black and POC artists. So I just want to say that Afrofuturism isn't just a fad to promote Black created content. It's a point of healing for us, and it validates visions for Black creators and represents in a future world. And for us to take up space as BIPOC in order to tell our stories in our own creative language that everybody can understand. Technology is more accessible, so Black creatives can now do more with less. And with the Black community around the world pushing real change, it's a hopeful time to see narratives helmed by Black creatives. Thank you very much, and that's the end of my presentation.
That was amazing. Thank you so much for that.
Oh, you're welcome. I hope I wasn't rushing.
Sorry?
I hope I wasn't rushing too much.
No. I mean, there was so much ground to cover. And I'm really, really, really thankful that we got to preserve this. We're putting it up on our YouTube afterwards.
Oh, okay. Oh, great.
It's going to be like a deep dive for so many people to make like, must read, must watch lists. The Du Bois information, I did not know that he was a sci-fi writer. I knew about as a co-founder of NAACP and never, ever, wow. Anyways, there's so much beautiful stuff in this. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
And we have a pile of people who are watching here.
Oh, wow.
And the loads, if you read the notes, you'll see a lot of comments people have given to you. Lots of people saying, literally, we love you, Carolyn. So thanks a lot. And in the virtual rooms, thank you for joining us today. So we're all sort of getting the swing of this virtual way of addressing. I mean, Carolyn, you're a podcaster, so you're more in the groove for this, I feel.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was great. And do listen to Carolyn's podcast.
Yes, really melanated. Yes, with Ashley Blackwell. Yeah.
So I believe that's it. Thank you very much, everyone. And bon cinema, go watch a pile of great movies. Ciao.
Okay, bye.